Check it out. Pretty cool. Oh man, if you've been following me or you've known me for any amount of time now, you know I used to work for a company called Raw Nutrition, owned by 4-time Mr. Olympia, Chris Bumstead, and he just dropped an energy drink called Bum Energy. Not a lot of caffeine, a lot of focus, great little shot of energy. Plus, it looks like it's in a little beer can, which I think is cool. We are talking about why I bought the Sony A7IV, and I went from Sony to Canon, back to Sony. First, if you don't know much about the A7IV, let's get some simple specs out of the way. It has the new Bion Z XR processor. It has a 33 megapixel sensor, can shoot 10 frames a second on JPEG or compressed RAW, which honestly isn't that ideal for image quality. It has 14-bit bit depth for stills. It can shoot H.264 and H.265 video codecs. It records 422 10-bit internally. It does 4K 20 frames a second downsample from 7K. It can do 4K 60 frames per second, but it is cropped. It has no recording limit, AI-based autofocus, which includes improved tracking and eye autofocus. The picture profiles match the more video sensor cameras, so you have S-Cinematone and S-Log3. It has focus breathing compensation and enhanced stabilization with 5-axis steady shot. It also has full-size HDMI and a bunch of other great ports that you can use. These are just some high-level specs that mean the most to me about this camera. If you want a more in-depth review, just search A7IV review on YouTube and you'll find a bunch of very detailed reviews about everything that has to do with this camera and all of the specs that might help you decide if it's the right camera for you. With that out of the way, let's talk about the main reasons why I purchased this camera and what swayed my decision. First, let's talk about the 33 megapixel sensor. This thing is incredibly sharp, comparable in my eyes to my Canon R5, which I'm filming on right now. And why I find that so compelling is because this camera is only $2,500 on the market as of right now, whereas the Canon R5 is $1,000 more than that. If you were to pixel peep the images, you might be able to see the extra 10 megapixels you're getting out of the R5, but honestly, I kind of prefer the image coming out of this camera. Similar to other high megapixel cameras on the market, this allows me to crop in and get more flexibility and range out of my lenses. Sitting on the A7IV right now is a Sigma 2470, and if I want to get more out of this lens, all I have to do is custom map a button and crop in quickly so I get more out of the camera. Yes, you lose some benefits out of the megapixels when you're cropping in, but if you're using it for something like social media, then this is not a big deal and you're probably not even gonna notice the difference. Another benefit for me, and one of the main reasons I got this camera, is arguably, in my opinion, it is the best hybrid camera on the market today. I know there's the Canon R6, the Canon R5 that are coming on right now, other Panasonic options, and then there's the new ZV-E1 that is marketed towards vloggers, but still a pretty good all-around camera. Because I shoot both photo and video for my creative freelancing work, I needed a good hybrid camera that was great at both things. I know the A7IV is not necessarily the best photo camera or the best video camera, but what's nice about this is it's incredible at both and comparable, in my opinion, to my R5. With the ability to shoot photos at 33 megapixels and record video at 422 10-bit 4K internally, that's a pretty good camera in my opinion. I know there are some drawbacks for people with the 4K 60 crop. It doesn't affect me that much, but if I am shooting real estate or anything that needs an ultra wide field of view, this is still a B cam. You gotta remember, you need to pick a camera that solves your problems. An FX3 would solve the problem as an A cam for me in those situations. Or right now, the Canon R5 even solves that problem. But because of the clientele I'm serving now and the work I do here on YouTube, having an A and a B cam is almost essential, but that's for my workflow. That might not necessarily be what you need. And when it comes to video, the dynamic range and quality of the A7IV is pretty incredible. I know it's not the Canon R5 that can shoot 8K 12-bit RAW. At that point, aren't we talking about an entirely different class of camera? It is great that it can do that, but realistically, how often am I gonna be using the 8K footage? It might overheat in 5 minutes. I'm also not making film documentaries yet, but I can still get pretty comparable video quality on something I consider a B cam. So for me, having the needs of a hybrid camera, the A7IV pretty much checks all the boxes. I also honestly love the dial system. I think some of the changes that Sony made to the body here allowed me to custom map the dials to the things that I need, so I don't have to flip to the menu or touch the screen to change settings very often. As a shooter who likes to switch between photo and video and who's using it as a hybrid camera. To give you an idea of how I set up the dials for my preferences, the left dial on the top is for my shutter speed, the right is for my ISO, and then the dial in front by the on and off switch is used for aperture. Something not mentioned too often in other Sony A7IV reviews is the body size. It's probably because I'm coming from a Canon R5. I prefer the size of this camera. I like the way it feels. It actually feels a little bit bigger than the A7 III that I used to shoot with, and it just feels small and compact, but still feels good in the hand. I think there's also something to be said about how a camera feels. The Canon feels all right, but I've always felt that the Sony just fit me better. I don't know how to further explain that, but some of the features and functions that are on the camera are a lot easier, quicker for me to switch through as I'm shooting in different scenarios. Something I'm really excited about now getting back into Sony is the low light performance. The Canon R5 and other Canons I've used just don't do great in low light, and Sony's always been known for having great low light performance, so I'm excited to start being able to shoot in more scenarios. I tend to shoot in darker situations like gyms, at night, and when you're shooting in formats like C-Log or S-Log3, you really want more flexibility and dynamic range when it comes to light hitting the sensor. All right, so now let's talk about a few drawbacks. Not every camera is perfect. Think 80-20 when you're buying a camera. What problems does it solve the most? After owning several different camera brands and models within those brands, I've noticed that you kind of have to pick and choose the things that you want. So for the A7IV, the big one for a lot of people has been the 4K 60 crop. Like I said earlier, it's not that big of a deal to me because this is a B cam. If you predominantly shoot real estate, landscapes, or you shoot with more wide angle lenses, this might not be the best option just because there is a crop. The next question I would ask is, can you live with it based on all the benefits you get out of the camera? Do you need to use 4K 60 in those situations, or can you get away with 4K 24? Now remember, like I mentioned, I do shoot in situations where I would need a wide angle lens, and it would be nice to have 60 or 120 frames a second. My R5 can accomplish those things. And hopefully, as I transition into an FX3, that will do the same. Another drawback for some who might not already be in the Sony system but are on the fence is the menu system, and I don't see why that's a big issue, to be honest. It's a menu system. You learned how to use Premiere Pro, DaVinci, Final Cut, and that was hard at first and you got over it. So you just live with what you have, and I don't even think it's that complicated. Once you know where everything's at, the menu system's not a big deal. So I don't even know if this is a concern right now, or if it's a worry of people, or if people are still arguing over the Canon menu system is better than the Sony. But the other nice thing with a camera like this and mini cameras who have a lot of features and dials on the body is you can customize those menu settings to be a lot more functional externally for how you're shooting. You don't have to dive into the menu system, and you can create custom menus. Again, is it a drawback? Is it debatable? I'm not sure, but not a big deal to me. If you've done any digging on this camera, you know the rolling shutter is not great. I'm not whipping my camera back and forth or trying to do crazy transitions in videos, so it's not that big of a deal to me. But if you do shoot things like wildlife, sports, racing, and automotive, I think that might be a bit of a concern. I imagine you could probably live with it in certain situations, but as long as you're aware it's there, you can try to find ways to combat it. Again, it's just personal preference and what your needs are. I have no worry about bad rolling shutter. It's honestly not that great though. And then the biggest worry of them all is probably overheating. I live in Central Texas. It's about to be 90 degrees outside, and I haven't had any issues with overheating yet. As you know, I'm shooting on the R5 right now, and I've had that overheat a small handful of times, but it wasn't hindering my video capabilities. If you're outdoors in the heat of the summer shooting a wedding, you may run into some overheating issues. I know there's some settings you can change in here to try to combat that, and there have been situations where it has overheated for some people, but not others. I believe it's kind of hit or miss depending on what you're doing and how you're shooting, but as long as you're not crowding the body of this camera, I think you're gonna be fine for the most part. I would consider this next one a drawback because I am coming from a camera that does shoot higher frames per second, but the 10 frames per second that this camera can shoot is really not that impressive to me. The other downfall is you can only do that in JPEG or compressed RAW. All my photos are shot primarily in uncompressed RAW, so I really don't have much flexibility there. I haven't really personally run into any issues with that. It's just something I'm gonna have to get used to. One of the other big reasons I got this camera is because of the Sony ecosystem. In the beginning of my career, I was using a Sony A7 III, and that got me extremely far from understanding the technical side of using cameras, lighting, audio, and everything to get me to where I am today. And then I elevated to the Canon R5. And that has been honestly an incredible camera. It's a rock star. It does so many things great from a hybrid perspective. Both photo and video are immaculate. I would definitely recommend the Canon R5 to anyone who wants to be in the Canon ecosystem. But if you've read any news on Canon regarding the RF mounted lenses in the last 6 months, you'll know that they're stopping third-party manufacturers from making them. And personally, for me as a Canon user, that's a giant drawback. I love the Canon RF glass. I think Canon is an incredible brand, and I think they've done extremely well with the quality of their product. But that's a giant shift for a user in the Canon world, especially someone who doesn't have the capability or even the desire to spend an immense amount of money on Canon branded lenses. And for me, that's exactly why I'm going back to the Sony system. I'm sure some people might argue that you're paying for quality with the Canon, right? As someone who needs to be cognizant of their lens investments right now in my career, Sony makes way more sense. Don't get me wrong, I know Sony has some drawbacks too. They don't update firmware on certain camera bodies. They have a slew of cameras that all compete with one another, but that's also what I like about them. They have options for different levels of users, different budgets, and different needs. For me, the A7IV feels like a sweet spot in my camera journey. Will it change? It's likely, but that doesn't mean these cameras will be obsolete for several years. I think right now is one of the most exciting times to be in the market for a camera, but also most overwhelming. You have some insane cameras from the Panasonic S5 Mark II, you have the Canon's new R6, you have Sony's A7IV, the A7R5, the FX3, and now the ZV-E1. You have a ton of options, which is great, but it can get extremely overwhelming. I think the questions you should answer for yourself when deciding to get a new camera is, what problems am I trying to solve? What clients are you working with? What clients are you trying to work with? What situations are you shooting for? That comes down to understanding what capabilities each camera has and the lens options that come with it. So here's some questions that I had to answer. Is Canon the right brand for me? The answer was no, because third-party RF lenses are no longer being manufactured. The RF line is super expensive. There's a pretty big leap when it comes from the R5 into the C70, and then where are you going after that, especially if you're in filmmaking? The other question I had to answer is, can I afford two Canons? Honestly, pretty expensive to be a Canon user nowadays. And Sony has so many options incrementally all the way up to the FX6 that I didn't think I would have a problem solving any specific needs anytime soon. So I hope this has helped you decide maybe if the A7IV is right for you, or if it's encouraged you to dig a little deeper in your decision-making process when it comes to buying a new camera. Use YouTube and other recommendations as resources to understand if a camera or a lens is going to solve your problems. That's where you should start, and that's where you should end. The Sony A7IV is going to solve a lot of problems for me as a B cam, as a photo camera, and as an overall monster of a hybrid camera. So I appreciate you guys watching as always. I'll see you in the next one.